Picture this, the year 1588, and one of the most powerful naval forces ever assembled, the Spanish Armada, rides the waves toward England, poised to crush Queen Elizabeth's reign. But then the unthinkable happens. A furious storm erupts, scattering ships like toys, driving them onto rocky shores, and drowning Spain's dreams of conquest in a single night. This wasn't just bad luck, it was history bending under the weight of weather, and it's far from the only time nature's whims have rewritten the fate of nations. From ancient battles to modern wars, from famines that toppled empires to hurricanes that redirected entire economies, weather doesn't just happen in the background, it's a silent architect of human destiny. Think about it, a single gust of wind, a sudden downpour, or an unseasonable frost can mean the difference between victory and ruin. We like to believe we're in control of our world, but nature has a way of humbling even the mightiest civilizations. And today, we're diving into 25 of the most jaw-dropping moments when weather didn't just change the forecast, it changed everything. This isn't just a list of disasters, it's a journey through the hidden threads connecting climate and chaos, showing how something as ordinary as rain or wind can unravel empires, spark revolutions, and even decide who sits on the throne. You'll hear about blizzards that saved cities, droughts that fueled wars, and freak storms that tipped the scales in battles you thought you knew. So settle in, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a cloudy sky the same way again. The story of humanity isn't just written in ink or stone, sometimes it's written in the storm. The Spanish Armada's fate wasn't just a case of bad weather, it was a perfect storm of arrogance, miscalculation, and nature's fury colliding. King Philip II of Spain had spent years assembling this legendary fleet, 130 ships, 30,000 men, and enough firepower to crush Protestant England once and for all. But the English Channel, notorious for its treacherous winds, had other plans. As the Armada advanced in their tight crescent formation, a tactic meant to overwhelm the smaller, faster English ships, gale force winds began to rip through their ranks. Eyewitness accounts describe sails shredded like paper, waves swallowing entire galleons, and sailors clinging to splintered masts as the storm drove them toward the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. One Spanish captain wrote in his final log, "The heavens themselves seemed to fight for the heretics. The Spanish lost over 50 ships and 15,000 men, not to English cannons but to waves and wind." The survivors who washed ashore faced starvation or execution, their once proud fleet reduced to wreckage. The ripple effects were staggering. Spain's dominance as a global superpower began to crumble, while England, spared from invasion, surged into the golden age of Elizabethan exploration. Without that storm, the world might never have seen the rise of British naval supremacy, or the colonies that would later shape the modern era. It's a haunting reminder, sometimes the tides of history don't turn because of kings or armies, but because the sky simply refuses to cooperate. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the peak of his power in 1812, commanding an army of over 600,000 men, the largest Europe had ever seen. His Grand Armée was an unstoppable force, a well-oiled war machine that had crushed every opponent in its path. But as they marched into Russia that summer, none of them could have imagined the true enemy waiting for them wasn't the Russian army, it was winter itself. The first snowflakes fell in early November, and what began as a light dusting soon became a nightmare. Temperatures plummeted to -30°C, a cold so brutal it froze brandy in canteens and turned wounded soldiers into statues where they fell. French soldiers' diaries tell horrifying tales, men collapsing mid-march, their bodies abandoned because the ground was too frozen to dig graves. Horses died by the thousands, their carcasses stripped for meat, leaving the army without cavalry or supply wagons. One soldier wrote, "The wind cuts like a knife and every step feels like walking through hell itself." Napoleon had expected a quick victory, but the Russians used the weather as a weapon. Instead of engaging in battle, they retreated deeper into the country, burning their own villages and crops to deny the French food or shelter. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, the city was already in flames, leaving his army starving and exposed. The retreat that followed was even deadlier than the advance. Men froze to death in their sleep, entire regiments vanished in blizzards, and desperate soldiers resorted to cannibalism. Only 40,000 men, less than 7% of the original force, made it back to France alive. Napoleon's reputation as an invincible general was shattered, and his enemies seized their chance. Within 2 years, he was forced to abdicate and exiled to Elba. That Russian winter didn't just end a campaign, it unraveled an empire. And it's a chilling reminder that no matter how brilliant a leader may be, they're still at the mercy of the skies. Twice in just 7 years, the mighty Mongol Empire, the same unstoppable force that had conquered from China to Eastern Europe, saw its fleets obliterated not by samurai swords, but by typhoon winds so violent they entered legend. In 1274, Kublai Khan sent 900 ships and 40,000 soldiers to subdue Japan, a campaign that began with terrifying success. The Mongols' advanced siege weapons and coordinated cavalry tactics shattered Japanese defenses on the beaches of Hakata Bay, pushing the outmatched samurai inland. Then, without warning, the skies darkened. Witnesses described a blackened horizon, waves taller than castles, and winds that snapped masts like twigs. The typhoon raged for 2 days, drowning most of the invasion force and scattering the survivors so badly that the Mongols had to retreat in disgrace. Japan celebrated this as a miracle, calling the storms Kamikaze, the divine wind, proof their islands were protected by the gods themselves. But Kublai Khan wasn't finished. 7 years later, he launched the largest naval invasion in history until D-Day, 1,400 ships and an estimated 140,000 men. This time, the Japanese were ready, building coastal walls and harassing the Mongol fleet with guerrilla attacks. Yet once again, nature intervened. An even fiercer typhoon struck, annihilating the entire armada in a single night. Eyewitness accounts from the few survivors tell of ships thrown onto cliffs like toys, drowning screams lost in the howling wind, and waves so massive they swallowed entire divisions. The cultural impact was profound. The Kamikaze legend became central to Japan's identity, fueling centuries of belief in divine protection, a belief that resurfaced tragically during World War II with the suicide pilots bearing the same name. Samurai folklore wove the storms into art and theater, portraying them as spectral dragons defending the homeland. Modern meteorologists now believe these were Category 4 or 5 super typhoons with winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour. Without them, the Mongols, masters of adapting to foreign terrains, might have succeeded, reshaping Japan's isolationist history forever. Sometimes the weather doesn't just change battles, it forges national myths. August 29, 1776, and George Washington's Continental Army is trapped. The British have pinned them against the East River in Brooklyn, outnumbering them nearly 3-1. After a brutal defeat in the Battle of Long Island, Washington's forces are exhausted, disorganized, and desperate. The British General William Howe, confident the rebellion is all but crushed, orders his men to wait. Tomorrow they'll finish the job. But tomorrow never comes for Howe, because tonight the weather has other plans. As darkness falls, a thick, almost supernatural fog rolls in off the water, swallowing the shoreline whole. Visibility drops to just a few feet, perfect cover for an escape Washington never should have pulled off. With silent urgency, the Continental Army begins ferrying 9,000 men across the river in rowboats, guided by fishermen who know the waters. The fog muffles the creak of oars, the splash of oars, even the whispered commands. At one point, the wind shifts, threatening to blow the mist away and expose the retreat. But then, as if answering Washington's silent prayers, the fog thickens again, clinging stubbornly until the last boat slips away at dawn. the British wake to an eerie silence. The rebels, along with every cannon, supply cart and musket, are gone, vanished like ghosts. Historians still debate what might have happened without that fog. Some argue the war would have ended right there, with Washington captured or killed and the Continental Army shattered beyond rebuilding. Others suggest the revolution might have limped on, but without Washington's leadership, morale would have collapsed long before Saratoga or Valley Forge. One thing's certain, that fog didn't just save an army, it saved a movement. The British spent the rest of the war underestimating Washington's luck, never realizing how often the weather itself seemed to fight for the rebels. And for the Americans, it became part of the revolution's mythology, proof that Providence favored their cause. Later, Washington himself would write that the fog felt like the hand of destiny. Sometimes history doesn't turn on grand speeches or brilliant tactics. Sometimes it turns on something as simple as the right mist at the right moment, hiding the right men. 1816 should have been like any other year: spring planting, summer harvests, autumn preparations for winter. But instead, farmers across the northern hemisphere watched in horror as snow fell in June, frost blackened crops in July, and winter seemed to arrive in August. This was the year without a summer, a global catastrophe sparked by something that happened a world away: the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia the year before. When Tambora exploded in April 1815, it unleashed the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The blast was heard over 2,000 kilometers away, sending a column of ash 50 kilometers into the stratosphere. Sulfur dioxide gas mixed with water vapor, forming a sun-blocking haze that spread across the planet. Temperatures plummeted. New England saw frost every month of the year. In Europe, wheat and potato fields rotted under endless rain, triggering famine. In China, unseasonable cold killed rice paddies, leading to mass starvation. Switzerland was so desperate that people ate moss and tree bark, while riots broke out in France over bread shortages. But the strangest consequence of this disaster might be literary. That summer, a group of friends, including Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and his 18-year-old fiancée Mary, were vacationing in Switzerland, trapped indoors by relentless storms. Bored and restless, they challenged each other to write ghost stories. Mary Shelley's contribution, a tale about a scientist who defies nature's laws only to face monstrous consequences. That story, of course, became Frankenstein, a novel born from a volcanic winter's gloom. The eruption's legacy didn't end there. Failed harvests forced thousands to abandon their farms. In America, New Englanders fled west, accelerating migration into the Midwest. Europe's food shortages fueled social unrest, setting the stage for revolutions. Even wine changed. The cooler years produced exceptionally acidic grapes, creating vintages still studied today. Mount Tambora's eruption didn't just alter weather, it reshaped culture, migration, and even literature. It's a stark reminder that when nature shifts, humanity doesn't just adapt, it reinvents itself in the chaos. The Great Plains of America were once called the breadbasket of the world, a golden sea of wheat stretching from Texas to Canada. But by the 1930s, that sea had turned to dust, fine, choking, lifeless dust that filled lungs, buried farms, and blotted out the sun for days at a time. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a drought, it was an ecological nightmare decades in the making. Farmers had torn up the native prairie grasses that held the soil in place, lured by high wheat prices during World War I. Then the rain stopped. Year after year, the land baked under unrelenting sun, until the winds came and carried the topsoil away in towering black blizzards. One survivor described it like this: the dust got so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. It seeped through cracks in windows, coated dinner plates, turned babies' lungs to mud. By 1934, an area the size of Pennsylvania had literally blown away. Farms that had fed a nation became wastelands overnight. And this wasn't just bad luck, it collided with the Great Depression's worst years, turning economic despair into full-blown catastrophe. Banks foreclosed on dust-choked land, and starving families ate tumbleweeds or jackrabbits when crops failed. That's when the exodus began. Over 2 million Ockies and Arkies, many not even from Oklahoma or Arkansas, but labeled as such, packed jalopies with everything they owned and headed west, following Route 66 to California's promised land. Their stories became the defining tragedy of the era, immortalized in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. But the real soundtrack of the Dust Bowl came from a skinny folk singer named Woody Guthrie, who rode those same dusty roads with migrant workers. His guitar became a protest weapon, spinning tales of hardship in songs like "This Land Is Your Land" and "Dust Bowl Blues." One line from his lyrics cut especially deep. "So long, it's been good to know ya, this dust's getting thicker and I'm getting outer here." The government's response reshaped America forever. New Deal programs like the Soil Conservation Service taught farmers contour plowing and crop rotation, while Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps planted 200 million trees as windbreaks. But the scars lingered. Many migrants found California no paradise, met with hostile "No Ockies" signs and backbreaking labor in fruit fields for pennies. The Dust Bowl forced a reckoning, proof that human arrogance toward the land could backfire spectacularly. And in today's era of climate change and megadroughts, those black blizzards feel less like history and more like a warning. The fate of D-Day, and perhaps the entire Second World War, hung on a weather report. June 5, 1944, and General Dwight Eisenhower paces inside a cramped, map-covered room at Southwick House in England. Outside, rain lashes the windows and wind howls across the channel. The largest amphibious invasion in history is scheduled for dawn, but the storm raging overhead threatens to turn the beaches of Normandy into a death trap. Then a quiet Scottish meteorologist named James Stagg steps forward with a prediction so improbable, it sounds like madness. A 36-hour break in the weather, just long enough to land 156,000 men on Hitler's fortress coast. Stagg wasn't just guessing. For weeks, he'd been analyzing conflicting data from Allied and captured German weather stations, tracking pressure systems across the Atlantic with obsessive precision. The night before, he'd delivered crushing news. The invasion couldn't happen June 5th. Eisenhower postponed, but Stagg kept watching. Now he spotted a sliver of hope, a high-pressure system edging in from the Azores, set to carve a narrow gap between storms. The window was razor-thin. Landing craft would have rough seas going in, but calmer waters by midday. Paratroopers would jump through cloud cover, risking scattered drops. One wrong calculation, and the Allies might drown before reaching the shore. Eisenhower's advisors were split. British officers urged caution, while American commanders, fearing tightened German defenses, pressed for action. The general turned to Stagg. "Are you staking your reputation on this?" Stagg, a man who'd spent his career in the shadows of more flamboyant scientists, didn't hesitate. "We're getting one clear chance," he replied. At 4:15 in the morning, Eisenhower made the call. "Okay, let's go." What followed was a meteorological gamble that changed history. The Germans, relying on forecasts from fewer stations, assumed no invasion could come in such weather. Rommel, convinced the Allies would wait for clearer skies, even left Normandy to celebrate his wife's birthday. When Allied paratroopers began dropping behind enemy lines on June 6th, the element of surprise was absolute. The break in the storm held just long enough. Waves still battered the landing craft at Omaha Beach, but by afternoon, the skies cleared for Allied bombers to pound German reinforcements. Stagg's forecast didn't just enable D-Day, it exploited Hitler's blind spot. The Nazis had invested in tanks, not meteorology, dismissing weather as a secondary concern. Yet this single brief window allowed the Allies to secure a beachhead, cracking open Fortress Europe. After the war, Eisenhower would call Stagg the man who won the war for us, though few remember his name today. History favors the soldiers on the beaches, not the scientists who read the sky, but without that forecast, the beaches might have run red with far more blood. Sometimes victory isn't just about courage or firepower. Sometimes it's about clouds moving at exactly the right speed. The winter of 1709 began like any other, chimneys smoking over Paris, vineyards dormant in the French countryside, soldiers huddled around campfires in the Low Countries. Then the temperature dropped and kept dropping. By January 6th, Europe found itself in the grip of the Great Frost, a cold so deep it froze the Thames solid enough to host winter fairs, turned the Venetian canals to ice, and even made wine barrels burst in the cellars of Versailles. Thermometers, still a novelty at the time, recorded -15 degrees Celsius, unheard of for an era before central heating or insulated clothing. For armies fighting the War of the Spanish Succession, this wasn't just discomfort, it was existential. French troops, already strained by years of war, watched as supply wagons froze in place, their axles snapping like icicles. Horses died by the hundreds, their stiffened corpses littering roadsides. One officer wrote, "The very breath of men crystallizes on their beards, and to touch a musket barrel bare-handed is to lose skin." But the cold was an equal opportunity destroyer. Allied forces under the Duke of Marlborough suffered just as badly, their siege lines around Lille collapsing as frost made digging trenches impossible, and cannon wheels sank into suddenly brittle earth. Entire regiments deserted, not from cowardice, but because frostbite had left them unable to hold a rifle. The frost didn't just starve armies, it starved nations. Olive trees centuries old turned to kindwood in Provence. Wheat seedlings froze in the ground, triggering bread riots from London to Lyon. In Prussia, birds fell dead from trees mid-flight, and wolves crept into villages to snatch livestock or children. The economic shockwaves were staggering. With vineyards decimated, France's wine exports cratered, while Baltic timber became priceless as frozen rivers blocked transport. The price of grain quadrupled in months, and in Ireland, the failure of the potato crop foreshadowed the horrors to come a century later. Politically, the frost became a stealth negotiator. Peace talks, stalled for years, suddenly gained urgency as rulers realized no kingdom, not even son King Louis XIV's France, could withstand both war and climate. The Treaty of Utrecht, which eventually reshaped Europe's balance of power, owed as much to that frozen winter as to any battlefield. The lesson was clear: nature doesn't take sides. It simply exposes who's prepared and who's clinging to power by fingertips already blackening with frost. The Caribbean in 1780 was supposed to be a season of war, not wind. British and French fleets clashed over sugar-rich islands, while American privateers, fresh off their revolution, raided merchant ships under both flags. But on October 10th, nature declared war on everyone. What began as a typical tropical disturbance swelled into something monstrous, a hurricane so devastating it would be called the Great Hurricane of 1780 and remain the deadliest Atlantic storm in recorded history. Ships caught in its path never stood a chance. The HMS Phoenix, a 74-gun British warship, was thrown onto the rocks of Martinique like driftwood, killing all 600 aboard. Over in Barbados, wind gauges, then the most advanced in the world, shattered after recording gusts over 200 miles per hour. Entire towns were scoured off the map instant. Lucia, the storm surge drowned 5,000 in a single hour, leaving bodies tangled in mangrove roots for weeks. One survivor wrote, "The air itself seemed to scream, and the sea rose up like a great black wall to swallow the land whole." By the time the storm faded, 22,000 were dead, more than some European battles of the era. For European navies, the hurricane was a tactical earthquake. The British lost 40 ships in one night, their Caribbean dominance shaken not by enemy fire but by wind. Naval architects rushed to redesign hulls for stability, not just firepower, and captains began avoiding hurricane season entirely, a practice still followed today. The storm also exposed colonial fragility. Plantation economies, already strained by slave rebellions and war, couldn't recover. France's sugar exports plummeted, deepening debt that would later spark revolution. In Britain, the financial shockwaves made Parliament question whether holding distant islands was worth the cost, but the storm's cruelest twist was its timing. Just weeks earlier, a young naval officer named Horatio Nelson had survived a skirmish off Antigua, only to be reassigned away before the hurricane hit. Had he stayed, history might have lost the man who'd later triumph at Trafalgar. Instead, the storm carved a path for his rise, proving once again that weather doesn't just destroy, it redirects fate in ways no one can predict. The Great Hurricane didn't just kill thousands, it whispered to empires that their age of unchallenged ocean rule was ending. And sometimes the loudest warnings come not from cannons but from the sky. The morning of September 8, 1900, dawned quietly over Galveston, Texas, a prosperous island city known as the Wall Street of the South. By nightfall, it would be a graveyard. The hurricane that slammed ashore that afternoon wasn't just another storm. It was an 80-mile-wide monster with a 15-foot storm surge that swept entire neighborhoods into the sea. Winds howled at 140 miles per hour, peeling roofs off buildings like bottle caps and flinging brick walls like matchsticks. Survivors later described the sound as a freight train that never stopped coming, the air so thick with flying debris that breathing felt like swallowing knives. When the waters finally receded, the devastation was beyond comprehension. 8,000 people, 1 in every 6 residents, lay dead beneath the rubble. Bodies piled so high they couldn't be buried. Instead, barges loaded with corpses were towed out to sea, only for many to wash back ashore with the tide. The city's once grand opera house, its bustling wharves, its rows of Victorian mansions, all reduced to splinters. A single heartbreaking statistic captures the scale. Galveston's death toll surpassed that of every other U.S. hurricane combined up to that point, but from this horror emerged 2 revolutions that would redefine America's relationship with weather. The first was architectural. Galveston didn't just rebuild, it re-engineered itself. Engineers jacked up surviving buildings by as much as 17 feet and constructed a massive seawall, the first of its kind in the nation, to shield against future storms. They even pumped sand from the Gulf to elevate the entire city, a feat so audacious it was dubbed the Grade-Raising Project. Streets that had been death traps in the storm now sat above sea level, a model coastal cities worldwide would later emulate. The second revolution was scientific. Before 1900, U.S. weather forecasting was primitive, relying on scattered telegraph reports and guesswork. The Galveston disaster exposed this fatal flaw. In its aftermath, Congress funded a centralized weather bureau with trained observers and storm warning systems. Meteorologists began tracking storms rather than waiting for them to hit, and the term hurricane entered public vocabulary as something to flee, not ignore. Galveston's tragedy didn't just change a city, it changed how humanity prepares for nature's fury. The next time you hear a hurricane warning or walk past a seawall, remember, those safeguards were born from a day when the sky taught America its deadliest lesson. Some disasters destroy, this one rewrote the rules. The year 535 should have been unremarkable, another season of planting and harvest in the endless cycle of ancient life. But instead, the world woke to a sun that shone like tarnished silver, casting no shadows even at noon. Crops withered under a sky that rained ash instead of water, and summer never came. For 18 months, the planet shivered through a darkness so profound, Byzantine historian Procopius wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness like the moon, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse." This wasn't just bad weather, it was a climate cataclysm so severe it rewrote the course of civilizations. Tree rings from that era tell a chilling story. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, growth patterns show a sudden, brutal cold snap, the worst in over 2,000 years. Some rings are so narrow they are almost invisible, evidence of years when trees barely survived. Modern scientists now point to a culprit, a massive volcanic eruption, likely in the tropics, so powerful it pumped millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, wrapping the Earth in a sun-blocking veil. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica contain sulfate spikes from this exact period, confirming a global volcanic winter. The human toll was unimaginable. In Constantinople, Procopius recorded snow in August and famine so dire people ate grass and dung. Grain shipments to Rome collapsed, starving a city already crumbling under barbarian invasions. Half a world away, Chinese chronicles describe frost in July and yellow dust falling like snow, while Mesoamerican murals depict skeletal figures kneeling before darkened skies. But the cruelest blow came next: plague. With harvests failed and populations weakened, the Justinian plague, history's first recorded pandemic, exploded across Europe, killing an estimated 25 million. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered, its dream of reuniting Rome shattered by disease and hunger. Yet the catastrophe also forged unexpected turns. In Arabia, the cooling may have triggered droughts that destabilized the Himyarite kingdom, paving the way for the rise of Islam. The Avars, fleeing frozen steppes, began their westward push, altering Europe's ethnic map. Even the legendary King Arthur's battles against Saxon invaders, if they happened at all, were likely fought against a backdrop of endless winter. What makes this event so haunting isn't just its scale, it's how easily history forgets. Unlike wars or earthquakes, this disaster left no ruins, just silent scars in tree rings and fragmented accounts. Yet it may have been the single greatest environmental shock to human civilization until the Black Death. A reminder that sometimes the most pivotal moments in history aren't marked by the clash of armies, but by a sun that forgets to shine. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, Europe shivered through what we now call the Little Ice Age, a period of relentless cold that turned summers into damp, grey affairs and winters into months-long sieges of ice. Rivers froze solid enough to host winter markets on the Thames, and alpine glaciers swallowed entire villages. But beyond the physical suffering, this cooling sparked something darker, a wave of terror that saw thousands accused of witchcraft, their alleged crime. Controlling the weather itself, court records from Germany to Massachusetts tell the same chilling story. When crops failed year after year, when unseasonable frosts blackened vineyards overnight, when cattle sickened from mysterious ailments, communities didn't blame climate, they blamed witches. In 1626, a priest in Bavaria wrote of hailstorms so destructive they seemed sent by the devil, and soon after, 63 women were burned for supposedly conjuring the tempests. Across Europe, weather magic became a standard accusation in witch trials. In Switzerland, a shepherd named Conrad Stoke confessed under torture to flying with demons to stir up storms. His story, extracted after a freak cold snap, ruined the harvest. Even educated elites subscribed to the hysteria. King James I of England, who wrote a book on demonology, personally interrogated women accused of sinking ships with summoned winds. The link between cold and persecution was no coincidence. Grain prices skyrocketed during the Little Ice Age, and hungry, desperate people needed someone to punish. Witch hunts peaked during the coldest decades, with trials clustering after particularly brutal winters. In Scotland, the infamous North Berwick witch trials began when storms nearly sank King James's ship. Storms his advisors claimed were magical revenge by a coven. Executions followed a grim pattern. First the milk cow died, then the child fell ill, then the neighbor pointed fingers. Women, especially those living alone, knowledgeable about herbs, or simply disliked, bore the brunt. A single suspicious hailstorm could doom a dozen, yet the tragedy had an ironic twist. Many weather witches were likely folk healers with real knowledge of nature's rhythms, people who'd traditionally been respected for predicting storms or advising when to plant. But as the climate grew more erratic, their old wisdom failed, making them targets instead of guides. In a cruel twist, the very cold that made crops unpredictable also made human judgment brittle. The legacy of this frenzy lingers. Scholars now see the Little Ice Age witch trials as a warning not about magic, but about how fear festers when societies face ecological chaos they don't understand. Sound familiar? Climate change today might not spark literal witch hunts, but it's no coincidence that conspiracy theories and scapegoating surge during droughts, wildfires, and hurricanes. The past whispers a lesson. When the weather turns against us, the real danger isn't the sky, it's what we'll do to each other in its shadow. On August 27, 1883, the island of Krakatoa exploded with a force 50,000 times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The blast was heard 3,000 miles away, equivalent to a detonation in New York being audible in London, and the shockwave circled the globe 7 times. But the volcano's most far-reaching impact wasn't the tsunami that killed 36,000 or the ash that blackened skies for hundreds of miles. It was what happened to the color of twilight. For months after the eruption, sunsets across the world turned an unearthly crimson, as fine volcanic dust high in the stratosphere scattered sunlight into eerie shades. In London, fire brigades rushed to extinguish what they thought were distant blazes, only to realize the horizon itself was on fire with light. Norway's skies burned so vividly red that locals whispered of biblical omens. And in Oslo, a young artist named Edvard Munch stood transfixed by the spectacle, later writing in his diary, "The sky turned to blood. I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature." That moment would haunt him for a decade, until he channeled it into his most famous work, The Scream, whose swirling, blood-orange sky wasn't abstract expressionism, but a direct echo of Krakatoa's atmospheric aftermath. Scientists, too, were mesmerized. Before Krakatoa, few understood how interconnected Earth systems truly were. But as they tracked the ash cloud's path using the new technology of spectrophotometers, they made a revolutionary discovery. Particles from a single eruption could alter global weather for years. Temperature records show the planet cooled by over 1 degree Celsius for half a decade, as the ash veil reflected sunlight back into space. Crops failed worldwide. Russian wheat harvests collapsed, triggering famine, while California's vineyards produced strangely smoky-tinted wine. Even the moon took on a blue hue some nights, its light filtered through lingering sulfur. Krakatoa's sunsets did more than inspire art and science. They revealed humanity's vulnerability to forces beyond control. When monsoon rains failed in India, British colonial officials blamed lazy natives rather than the volcano's climate disruption, exacerbating famines that killed millions. In New York, the spectacular skies sparked sensationalist newspaper claims of Martian invasions, showing how easily awe curdles into panic. And for the first time, ordinary people grasped that an event in distant Indonesia could reach into their evening skies, their crops, their very lungs. The irony: Krakatoa's violence birthed modern meteorology. Scientists like Britain's William Ashcroft used the event to prove wind patterns crossed continents, laying groundwork for today's weather satellites. Others realized volcanic winters might explain historical cold snaps like the one that followed Tambora in 1815. Even the scream endures as cultural shorthand for existential dread, proving nature's fury can echo through canvas as powerfully as through climate. So the next time you admire a fiery sunset, remember, beauty and catastrophe often share the same sky. Krakatoa didn't just obliterate an island, it painted the world in the color of upheaval, leaving brushstrokes that still linger in art labs and air currents today. The night of November 12, 1970, began like any other in the low-lying delta villages of East Pakistan. Fishermen mending nets, farmers sleeping in mud brick homes, children curled beside clay stoves. But by dawn, 500,000 of them would be dead, and the political shockwaves of their drowning would redraw the map of Asia. The Bhola cyclone wasn't just a storm, It was the deadliest tropical cyclone in recorded history, a 20-foot wall of water that erased entire islands from the Bay of Bengal in hours. Survivors described a sound like 1,000 trains roaring inland, seawater boiling over rice paddies, and palm trees snapping like matchsticks. One man, clinging to his rooftop as the surge ripped his family away, later said, "The water didn't rise, it jumped." The scale of neglect was as staggering as the storm itself. Warnings from Indian meteorologists who'd spotted the cyclone forming days earlier were ignored by West Pakistan's government. No evacuations were ordered. When villagers asked local officials for help, they were told, "Allah decides who lives." As corpses piled up in the days after, decaying in the tropical heat, Pakistan's military ruler, Yahya Khan, flew over the devastation for a single photo op before returning to a golf tournament in Karachi. Relief supplies from international donors rotted in warehouses diverted by corrupt officials. Newspapers in Dhaka ran headlines asking, "Does East Pakistan even exist to you?" The answer, it turned out, was no. The cyclone became the spark for a tinderbox of resentment. East Pakistan, though more populous than the West, had long been treated as a colony. Its Bengali language suppressed, its resources looted, its people treated as second-class citizens. When student protests erupted over the botched disaster response, the military answered with bullets. Mass arrests, rape campaigns, and Operation Searchlight's midnight raids followed, igniting the Bangladesh Liberation War. By December, India had intervened, and within 9 months, a new nation was born from the cyclone's ruins. But Bola's legacy wasn't just political. The disaster exposed gaping flaws in global humanitarian response. Relief agencies, overwhelmed by the chaos, realized they needed standardized protocols, leading to the creation of the United Nations Disaster Relief Office, the ancestor of today's international emergency systems. Meteorologists, horrified by the avoidable death toll, pioneered early warning networks for developing nations. Even the term storm surge entered public vocabulary after Bola, as scientists worked to explain why wind alone hadn't caused most deaths, it was the drowning. 50 years later, the lessons still sting. Cyclone shelters built in Bangladesh after Bola saved millions during later storms like Sidr in 2007. Satellite forecasting gives days of warning instead of hours, but the core warning remains: disasters are never just natural. They're shaped by corruption, inequality, and the choices of those in power. The Bola cyclone didn't just kill with water, it killed with indifference, and in its wake it proved that when the skies revolt, the ground beneath societies can fracture just as violently. The morning of January 30th, 1607, dawned calm over the Bristol Channel, but by midday, villages along the coast from Cornwall to South Wales were underwater. Witnesses described a mighty wall of water taller than church steeples, surging inland with such force it ripped oak trees from the ground and tossed fishing boats like twigs into fields. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a graveyard, at least 2,000 dead, whole parishes erased from the map, and salt-poisoned fields that wouldn't grow crops for decades. For centuries, historians blamed a massive storm surge, but newly uncovered parish records and coastal sediment studies suggest something far more terrifying: Britain's forgotten tsunami. The debate hinges on eerie details in survivor accounts. A merchant's letter describes the sea retreating, like Moses parting the Red Sea before the wave hit, a classic tsunami warning sign absent in storm surges. Church registries from devastated villages note the flood arrived around 9 in the morning on an otherwise clear day, with no prior wind or rain. Even stranger, fish were found stranded miles inland, still flapping on muddy fields when the water withdrew. Geologists now point to traces of marine sand in Somerset's peat layers, deposited far inland by a force no storm could muster. And here's the smoking gun. Offshore surveys reveal a massive underwater landslide along the Celtic Shelf, just north of the Channel, enough displaced rock to trigger a tsunami reaching 9 meters high. Yet the storm theory still has defenders. Meteorologists note that January is peak season for North Atlantic cyclones, and 16th century woodcuts show waves battering coastal walls sideways, consistent with hurricane winds, not a tsunami's straight-on surge. Parish records from upland towns mention the Great Tempest, though some scholars argue tempest could mean any disaster. The clincher, a recently discovered sailor's log from a Dutch merchant ship, which describes surviving a hurricane in the Channel that same morning with winds that tore the sails to rags. What makes this mystery so haunting isn't just the death toll, it's how quickly the disaster faded from memory. Unlike the Lisbon tsunami of 1755 or Krakatoa's global shockwaves, the 1607 catastrophe left barely a ripple in England's historical consciousness. No national day of mourning, no ballads, not even a Shakespearean allusion, though he was writing King Lear at the time. Some historians blame the Reformation's chaos, others suspect Tudor censors downplayed it to avoid panic. But the most poignant theory comes from a Welsh folktale about a drowned kingdom beneath the Channel, where church bells still ring underwater during storms. Perhaps forgetting was easier than confronting the truth, that Britain's shores too could vanish in an instant. Today, the debate isn't just academic. If the tsunami theory holds, it means Britain's coastlines are far more vulnerable than modern hazard maps suggest. Towns like Burnham-on-Sea and Cardiff sit atop sedimentary layers whispering of older floods that could come again. The 1607 disaster forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. When nature's violence leaves no monuments, how quickly do we forget? And when the water rises next time, will we even see it coming? Hitler's blitzkrieg had rolled across Europe like an unstoppable tide, France crushed in weeks, Poland carved up, Britain barely hanging on. But as Operation Barbarossa's panzer divisions advanced toward Moscow in the autumn of 1941, something far more dangerous than Soviet resistance awaited them: the coldest Russian winter in half a century. German soldiers, clad in summer uniforms meant for a swift victory, suddenly found their breath freezing in midair, their rifles jamming with ice, and their tank engines solidifying into useless blocks of metal. General Winter had entered the war. The numbers tell a nightmare story. By early December, temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius, so extreme that diesel fuel turned to jelly, lubricants hardened into glue, and tank treads snapped like glass. German mechanics worked barehanded on frozen engines, their skin peeling off with each wrench turn. One soldier's diary entry reads, "We pour boiling water over the tank's ignition, only for it to freeze again before we can start it." The cold isn't just an enemy, it's a silent siege. Horses, vital for transporting artillery, collapsed by the thousands, their corpses becoming grotesque landmarks in the snow. Frostbite turned toes and fingers black, with field hospitals performing over 15,000 amputations in a single month. Stalin, meanwhile, turned the weather into a weapon. While German intelligence dismissed Russian winter preparations as propaganda, Soviet factories had been producing skis, felt boots, and white camouflage suits since August. Siberian troops trained for Arctic warfare arrived fresh at the front, their T-34 tanks specially winterized with wider treads and antifreeze-cooled engines. Soviet planes, fueled by high-grade kerosene that didn't gel in the cold, dominated the skies as Luftwaffe aircraft sat grounded. Even Stalin's ruthless, not one step back order played into the cold's hands. Retreating Germans found no shelter, just scorched earth and villages burned by their own forces weeks earlier. The turning point came in early December, mere miles from Moscow's outskirts. With German supply lines stretched thin and temperatures still dropping, Marshal Zhukov launched a counterattack using fresh Siberian divisions. The Germans, unable to dig foxholes in frozen ground, were overrun. One Wehrmacht officer later confessed, "We didn't lose to the Russians, we lost to the snow." Hitler's dream of a quick Eastern victory evaporated, dooming Germany to a brutal two-front war. But here's the chilling irony. Napoleon's invasion had failed in almost identical fashion 129 years earlier. Hitler, convinced modern technology could conquer what the Grand Armée could not, ignored the warning. The winter of 41 didn't just save Moscow, it proved that no matter how advanced your weapons, nature writes the final rules of war. And sometimes the most formidable general isn't a man at all, but a season. The Black Sea wasn't known for hurricanes until November 14, 1854, when a storm so violent hit Balaclava harbor that seasoned sailors mistook it for the end of the world. The Crimean War was already a logistical nightmare. British and French troops besieging Sevastopol faced cholera outbreaks, rotting food, and a Russian winter looming. But nothing compared to the tempest that rolled in that morning, with waves tall enough to swallow three-masted ships whole. Winds ripped the roofs off barracks, hurled cannons like pebbles, and sent supply vessels crashing into cliffs. By dusk, 30 ships had sunk, including the HMS Prince, a state-of-the-art steam frigate carrying winter clothing, medical supplies, and ammunition desperately needed at the front. One officer wrote, "The sea did in one night what the Russian army couldn't in 6 months." The aftermath was a waking nightmare. Without those supplies, soldiers starved in frozen trenches, surgeons operated by candlelight with no bandages, and gangrene spread through overcrowded field hospitals. Typhus and dysentery ran rampant, killing more men than Russian bullets. Enter Florence Nightingale. Arriving just weeks after the storm, she found the Scutari hospital floors slick with sewage, rats gnawing at untreated wounds, and men dying of thirst because no one had washed their tin cups. The storm's destruction had exposed a truth more brutal than any battle. Armies weren't being defeated by enemies, but by bureaucratic incompetence. Nightingale's response changed history. She mapped mortality data, proving more soldiers died from disease than combat, and bullied generals into funding sanitation reforms. Her sanitary commission scrubbed hospital walls, installed ventilation, and boiled linens, cutting death rates by 2/3 within months. But her real legacy was systemic. The storm's chaos forced militaries to confront their own ineptitude. Britain established the first permanent army medical corps, adopted standardized supply protocols, and even redesigned hospital ships with storm-proof cargo holds. The irony, the same hurricane that nearly broke the Allied war effort became the catalyst for modern military medicine. What makes the Balaclava storm unforgettable isn't just the wind or waves, it's how disaster can scrub away stubbornness. Before the storm, Nightingale's pleas for hygiene were dismissed as female fussing. Afterward, her methods became gospel. Sometimes progress doesn't come from brilliance alone, but from nature's refusal to tolerate human stubbornness. And sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought with rifles, but with scrub brushes and statistics under a nurse's steady hand. The rain began in January 1937 and refused to stop. For 18 relentless days, the Ohio River basin was pounded by downpours that turned creeks into torrents, then rivers into monsters. By the time the skies cleared, the Ohio had swelled to over 20 miles wide in places, submerging cities under 30 feet of water and forcing 500,000 people from their homes. In Louisville, Kentucky, residents rowed boats down Broadway, past telephone poles where only the crossbeams poked above the surface. In Evansville, Indiana, families huddled on rooftops as ice floes the size of cars crashed through second-story windows. And in Cincinnati, the flood crested at 80 feet, drowning the entire West End under a churning brown sea filled with carcasses of livestock, shattered homes, and the bloated bodies of those who hadn't escaped in time. What made this flood different wasn't just its scale. It was the way it exposed America's crumbling infrastructure. Decades of unchecked development, deforestation, and shoddy levee construction had turned the Ohio into a ticking time bomb. When the waters rose, makeshift barriers collapsed like sandcastles. One survivor in Paducah described watching a levee burst. It wasn't a breach, it was an explosion. One minute the men were piling sandbags, the next they were gone, swallowed by a wall of water. The human toll was staggering. Nearly 400 dead, 1 million left homeless, and outbreaks of typhoid and pneumonia spreading through crowded refugee camps. But from this disaster emerged one of the New Deal's most enduring legacies. President Roosevelt, touring the devastation by boat, saw firsthand how piecemeal flood control had failed. Within months, his administration launched the Ohio River Flood Control Program, a monumental effort that built 70 new dams and thousands of miles of levees, not just repair but reimagining. The Tennessee Valley Authority expanded its mission, proving that multi-purpose dams could tame rivers while bringing electricity to impoverished regions. Engineers studied ancient indigenous mound-building techniques, realizing that pre-Columbian societies had understood floodplains better than modern planners. The flood also reshaped social policy. Photographers like Margaret Burke White captured images so harrowing, black families stranded on rooftops next to white ones, all equally desperate. They forced Americans to confront how poverty compounded disaster. Relief efforts became a testing ground for integrated housing projects, and the Federal Writers Project recorded survivor testimonies, preserving working-class voices often erased from history. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the small towns that chose not to rebuild. Places like Shawneetown, Illinois, once a thriving river port, relocated entire communities to higher ground, their original streets now silent beneath layers of silt. The 1937 flood didn't just change policies. It taught America that when nature speaks, sometimes the wisest response isn't to fight back but to step aside. And in that lesson lay the seeds of modern environmental thinking, that rivers aren't enemies to be conquered but forces to be respected. January 28, 1986, dawned colder than any previous space shuttle launch in history. At Florida's Kennedy Space Center, icicles draped the launch tower like glass daggers, and engineers scrambled to check systems as temperatures plunged to -8°C, far below operational limits. One man, a Morton Thiokol engineer named Roger Boisjoli, had been pleading with NASA for days. The rubber O-rings sealing the shuttle's solid rocket boosters turned brittle in cold weather, losing their ability to contain superheated gases. His team's data was unequivocal: below 12°C, the rings risked catastrophic failure. But after midnight, with the launch already delayed and pressure mounting from politicians and the public, NASA overruled the warnings. The final conference call ended with a chilling phrase from a NASA manager: "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." 73 seconds after liftoff, millions watching live on television saw Challenger explode in a billowing white plume, its fuel tank rupturing as one of those frozen O-rings failed. The crew cabin, intact at first, arced upward before plummeting into the Atlantic, a horrifying detail later confirmed by recovered wreckage. School children who tuned in to watch teacher Krista McAuliffe, NASA, a first ordinary citizen in space, found themselves witnesses to tragedy instead of inspiration. Boisjoli, watching the launch from Utah, later told investigators, "I knew exactly what happened before the announcer did, and I knew we'd told them." The aftermath became a masterclass in institutional failure. The Rogers Commission exposed a culture where schedule pressure and PR concerns overrode safety. Engineers' concerns had been buried in bureaucratic layers, while NASA officials eager to prove the shuttle's routine viability after years of delays downplayed risks. Even though weather data had been cherry-picked, managers cited temperatures from a warmer prior launch as justification, ignoring the overnight freeze. Commission member Richard Feynman famously demonstrated the O-ring's fragility on live TV by dunking a sample in ice water and snapping it in his hands. His verdict: for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Yet Challenger's legacy wasn't just about technical fixes, redesigned O-rings and stricter launch rules, but a cultural reckoning. The disaster shattered NASA's infallible image, grounding the shuttle program for nearly 3 years and shifting priorities from spectacle to science. Journalists began scrutinizing agency decisions rather than cheerleading them, and for engineers worldwide, Challenger became shorthand for the ethical duty to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. For families of the lost crew, the bitterest pill was learning their loved ones might have survived the initial explosion, only to perish on impact with the ocean. Their legacy lives in tightened astronaut safety protocols and the Challenger Center's STEM education programs. But the disaster's deepest lesson remains: when institutions prioritize image over physics, when they ignore warnings whispered by ice and rubber, the price isn't just failure, it's frozen fingerprints on memos that could have stopped it all. August 2003 was supposed to be a month of summer vacations, open-air markets, and lazy afternoons along the Seine. Instead, Europe found itself trapped under a dome of suffocating heat unlike anything in living memory. Temperatures soared to 44 degrees Celsius in France, nearly 20 degrees above normal, with night bringing no relief as urban heat islands turned cities into furnaces. The elderly suffered most. Thousands died alone in un-air-conditioned apartments, their bodies undiscovered for days. Parisian morgues overflowed so badly that refrigerated trucks parked outside became makeshift mortuaries. One undertaker recalled, "We ran out of coffins, the smell, it hung over the city like a curse." By the time cooler air finally arrived, 70,000 people across the continent had perished in what scientists would later call the first clear climate change catastrophe of the modern era. What made this heatwave terrifying wasn't just the temperature spikes, it was how thoroughly it exposed societal vulnerabilities. France's healthcare system, ranked among the world's best, buckled under the strain. Hospitals overflowed with heatstroke victims while staff struggled without emergency protocols for such extremes. In rural areas, farmers watched helplessly as livestock collapsed in fields and crops withered before harvest. Even the wine industry, usually a beneficiary of warm years, faced chaos. Grapes in Burgundy ripened so fast that sugar levels skyrocketed, forcing vintners to harvest weeks early or risk jammy, unbalanced wines. Chateau owners who'd spent centuries perfecting their craft suddenly found their terroir rewritten in a single season. Yet the disaster's most profound impact was psychological. Before 2003, climate change had been an abstract threat, something discussed in terms of polar ice caps or future generations. The heat wave made it personal. Meteorologists confirmed this wasn't just bad luck. Computer models showed human-caused warming had made such events at least twice as likely. French President Jacques Chirac, initially criticized for vacationing during the crisis, returned to declare environmental reform a national priority. Within a year, Europe launched its first continent-wide heat alert systems, while cities began redesigning public spaces with cooling green roofs and water features. The tragedy also birthed unexpected innovations. Sweden, seeing its own elderly suffer, pioneered cooling corridors in urban planning, green pathways that funnel breezes through concrete jungles. German engineers developed porous pavements to reduce heat retention, now standard in climate-resilient cities. Even the wine world adapted, with sommeliers noting that 2003's extreme vintage forced a re-evaluation of traditional techniques, ultimately improving resilience to temperature swings. But the haunting lesson of 2003 remains. Climate change doesn't just melt glaciers, it creeps into our homes, our hospitals, our vineyards. It rewrites rules we assumed were timeless, and as Paris learned the hard way, sometimes progress begins not with warnings but with refrigerated trucks and empty coffins. A visceral reminder that nature's ledger always settles accounts. The summer of 2010 was meant to be just another season in Russia's long history of agricultural abundance until the air itself seemed to catch fire. Temperatures in Moscow hit 38 degrees Celsius day after day, smashing records that had stood for 1,000 years, but the heat was only the beginning. Soon, peat bogs beneath the city ignited, shrouding the capital in a toxic smog so thick that visibility dropped to 20 meters. Morgues overflowed as the elderly succumbed to heat stroke and respiratory failure, while hospitals ran out of oxygen tanks. One doctor described the scene as breathing through a campfire while standing in an oven. Yet the real catastrophe wasn't unfolding in the cities, but in Russia's endless wheat fields. Drought turned the country's breadbasket into a dust bowl. Grain yields collapsed by 40%, forcing the government to ban wheat exports overnight, a decision that sent shockwaves through global markets. Russia wasn't just any producer, it supplied nearly a quarter of the world's wheat. Within weeks, prices for bread and pasta doubled in Egypt, where 40% of the population lived on less than $2 a day. In Tunisia, the cost of staple foods spiked so sharply that a young street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in protest, igniting the Arab Spring. Governments from Algeria to Yemen teetered as riots over food prices erupted in 40 countries. The Kremlin's attempt to protect its own people had unwittingly fueled revolutions halfway across the world. Satellite images from that summer tell a surreal story. Normally emerald green Russian farmland appeared scorched brown from space, while smoke from thousands of wildfires stretched in vast plumes across Siberia. The heat was so extreme that scientists calculated it was a once-in-a-100,000-year event, except climate models now suggest such extremes could become routine by 2050. Russian officials, initially dismissive of climate change, were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their own infrastructure was woefully unprepared. Firefighting aircraft sat grounded for lack of funding, while Soviet-era drainage systems had turned peatlands into tinderboxes. At one point, smoke from the fires reached the stratosphere, cooling parts of Europe even as Russia burned, a cruel irony that underscored how interconnected global weather systems truly are. The geopolitical fallout was just as dramatic. As wheat prices skyrocketed, speculators piled into commodities markets, exacerbating shortages. Saudi Arabia, fearing unrest at home, began buying up African farmland to secure future food supplies, a strategy now dubbed land grabbing. Meanwhile, Ukraine, another major wheat producer, saw its own harvests wither, adding strain to an economy already buckling under corruption. Some historians argue these agricultural failures set the stage for Russia's later annexation of Crimea, as the Kremlin sought control over Ukraine's fertile Black Sea breadbasket. What makes the 2010 heatwave so pivotal isn't just its body count or even its role in the Arab Spring. It's the way it exposed food security as the ultimate domino in climate politics. A few degrees of temperature shift in Russia didn't just mean a bad harvest. It meant riots in Cairo, revolutions in Damascus, and hunger in Lagos. The event forced economists to rethink their models, realizing that climate change doesn't just alter weather, it rewires the global economy one loaf of bread at a time. And for the millions who took to the streets that year, the message was clear. When the wheat runs out, the social contract burns with it. The island of Sumbawa had been rumbling for days, but on April 5, 1815, Mount Tambora exploded with a force that dwarfed any eruption in recorded history. The blast was heard over 2,000 kilometers away, and the sky rained ash so thick that ships hundreds of miles offshore found their decks covered in gray powder. The eruption column reached 50 kilometers into the atmosphere, injecting millions of tons of sulfur dioxide that would soon cloak the globe in a shroud of volcanic winter. But the devastation was only beginning. Half a world away in China, farmers noticed something strange. The summer of 1816 brought not the usual monsoon rains, but an eerie, unseasonable cold. Frost-blackened rice paddies in July, a death sentence for crops that should have been ripening under the sun. By harvest time, entire provinces faced starvation. As famine spread, desperation turned to fury. In Jiangsu and Shaanxi, mobs stormed grain storehouses, their anger sharpened by rumors that corrupt officials were hoarding food. Tax collectors, symbols of an already despised imperial system, became targets for violence. Records from the Qing dynasty describe riots where granaries were looted and magistrate offices burned. The unrest only quelled when troops fired into starving crowds. The Tambora famine didn't just kill, it exposed the brittle foundations of power, proving that even dynasties could crumble when the skies turned against them. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, New Englanders awoke to a year without summer. Snow fell in June, lakes froze in August, corn stalks withered in the fields, their kernels never swelling. With no harvest to sell, farmers defaulted on mortgages and banks folded by the dozens. In Vermont, church records describe poverty soups, watery broths of boiled weeds and tree bark, served in communal kitchens to keep families alive. Towns that had thrived on wheat and apples became ghostly as young men fled westward, joining the first great migration into the Midwest, the cold, even reshaped culture. When a group of writers, including Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, found themselves trapped indoors by endless rain in Switzerland, their ghost story contest birthed Frankenstein, a tale of human ambition colliding with nature's wrath. But the cruelest twist came in Europe, where the volcanic haze dimmed the sun so severely that solar storms erupted visible even at midday. Panicked farmers interpreted the blood-red skies as biblical omens, while scientists scrambled to explain the phenomenon. The price of bread quadrupled in London, and in Germany, horses collapsed mid-plow, their ribs protruding from starvation. Governments, caught between Enlightenment reason and primal fear, wavered between rationing programs and prayer vigils. Tambora's eruption didn't just alter weather. It rewired societies. From Chinese tax riots to New England's hollowed-out villages, the world learned a brutal lesson. Civilization is just a few failed harvests away from chaos. And sometimes the deadliest force in history isn't an army or an empire, but a volcano no one saw coming until it was too late. The samurai defending Hakata Bay in 1281 had faced the Mongols before 7 years earlier. They'd barely survived the first invasion when a typhoon scattered Kublai Khan's fleet. But this time, the invaders came in overwhelming numbers, 1,400 ships, their decks crammed with Chinese and Korean auxiliaries, their hulls packed with gunpowder bombs and fire arrows. For weeks, the outnumbered Japanese fought a desperate guerrilla war along the beaches, building makeshift coastal walls and launching nighttime raids in small boats. Then, on August 15th, the sky turned the color of bruised flesh. Survivor accounts from the Hachiman Gudaukan scrolls describe what happened next with eerie precision. The wind arrived first, howling like 1,000 demons, snapping the invaders' ship masts like kindling. Then the waves rose, not cresting gradually, but surging upward in sudden, monstrous walls. Mongol vessels, lashed together for stability, became death traps as the storm's fury flipped them like toys. Samurai watching from the cliffs saw armored warriors flailing in the churn, their heavy lamellar armor dragging them under. One warrior's diary notes, "The sea vomited corpses for days, their bloated faces blackened, their hands still clutching swords as if they meant to fight the ocean itself." The scale of destruction defied comprehension. Chinese records later estimated that 80% of the Mongol fleet, over 1,000 ships, vanished beneath the waves. Those that didn't sink outright were dashed against the rocky shores of Takashima Island, where archaeologists still find anchors and shattered hull timbers. The few survivors who made it to land were hunted down by samurai or torn apart by villagers. A Korean envoy's report to Kublai Khan described the disaster with chilling brevity. The heavens granted them victory, not men. But the typhoon's aftermath held an even darker spectacle. For weeks afterward, tides carried thousands of bloated corpses into Hakata Bay, creating a macabre flotilla that stretched as far as the eye could see. The stench of decay hung so thick that samurai lit incense on their helmets to endure it. Fishermen refused to cast nets, fearing they'd haul up the dead instead of fish. Buddhist monks performed mass burials at sea, their chants drifting over the water as bodies were weighted with stones and returned to the deep. This second kamikaze, this divine wind, cemented Japan's belief in its sacred invincibility. The Mongols, who had conquered empires from Beijing to Baghdad, had been undone not by samurai swords, but by the very air and water the Shinto gods commanded. That conviction would echo through centuries, resurfacing tragically in World War II when suicide pilots adopted the same name, convinced their sacrifices could again turn the tide of war. Today, marine archaeologists studying Hakata Bay find eerie reminders of that night. Mongol arrowheads fused by seawater, Chinese coins scattered across the seabed, and the bones of warriors still tangled in the wreckage. The storms didn't just save Japan, they birthed a legend that would shape its soul for better and worse. And on the cliffs above the bay, where samurai once watched an empire drown, the wind still howls with the memory of a day when nature chose a side. December 18, 1944, and the Pacific Fleet's Task Force 38 is hunting Japanese stragglers when the sea begins to twist beneath them. Admiral Halsey, a legend for his aggressive tactics, had pushed his ship's hard fuel running low, crews exhausted, and now a monster storm boiling on the horizon. The first warnings came too late. By the time radar picked up Typhoon Cobra's full fury, it was already upon them. 100-mile-per-hour winds, waves taller than apartment buildings, and rain so thick it blinded veteran navigators. On the bridge of the USS Monterey, a young officer named Gerald Ford, yes, that Gerald Ford clung to a railing as a 60-foot swell nearly capsized the carrier. Below decks, loose aircraft smashed like toys in a toddler's tantrum, sparking fires that crews battled in pitch darkness, but the worst fate awaited the destroyers. The USS Hull, Monaghan, and Spence nimble ships designed for speed, not storms, were caught broadside by the typhoon's most violent gusts. Survivors described a nightmare of physics gone wrong. As the ships rolled past 70 degrees, seawater flooded smokestacks, killing engines. Without power, the vessels became playthings for the waves. The hull capsized first, vanishing so fast that life rafts couldn't be deployed. A sailor on the Spence later recalled the sound of the hull buckling, like God himself stepping on a tin can. All three ships sank in minutes, taking nearly 800 men with them. Rescue efforts were impossible in such seas. Those who jumped overboard were pulverized by debris or swallowed by the storm. Halsey's reputation never fully recovered. A court of inquiry would later fault his decision to steam into the storm rather than around it, calling the losses a grave error in judgment. But Cobra's real legacy wasn't the court-martials, it was the revolution in naval meteorology it forced. Before the typhoon, weather forecasting at sea was rudimentary, reliant on spotty reports and guesswork. Afterward, the Navy established dedicated weather reconnaissance squadrons, equipped ships with advanced radar, and mandated strict avoidance protocols. Halsey himself became a cautionary tale, admitting in his memoir that no enemy fleet had ever hurt him as badly as that storm. Yet the bitterest irony lay in the storm's aftermath. As rescue crews pulled oil-slicked survivors from the water, they found haunting evidence of the typhoon's reach: Japanese life vests mixed with American ones. The enemy, it turned out, had suffered just as badly. Nature, it seemed, didn't care whose flag you flew, only how well you respected its power. And sometimes the cost of that lesson is measured not just in lost ships, but in the echoes of 800 voices swallowed by the wind. The Halloween nor'easter of 1991 didn't just rage, it unraveled the very line between science and myth. What began as a routine autumn storm off the coast of Nova Scotia soon mutated into something meteorologists still reference with hushed awe. Three weather systems: a cold front from the Great Lakes, a dying hurricane named Grace, and a high-pressure system over Quebec collided like atmospheric freight trains, birthing a storm so ferocious it earned the name the Perfect Storm. And for the crew of the Andrea Gale, a commercial fishing vessel out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, it would become the stuff of nightmares. Recovered buoy data tells part of the story. On October 28, buoy 4401, stationed 200 miles east of Cape Cod, recorded waves cresting at 100 feet taller than a 10-story building. Wind speeds hit 70 miles per hour, but the real terror lay in the waves' unpredictability. Unlike normal swells, which roll in consistent intervals, this storm created rogue waves, sudden walls of water that could snap a ship in half. The Andrea Gale's last radio transmission, garbled and desperate, mentioned seas 50 feet and building before static swallowed the rest. No distress call followed. The boat and its 6-man crew vanished, leaving behind only a few floating debris fields and fuel slicks spotted days later by Coast Guard aircraft. Yet the storm's legacy wasn't just tragedy, it reshaped how we understand maritime weather. Meteorologists pored over satellite images and buoy logs, realizing this wasn't just a bad storm, but a meteorological bomb, a term coined for systems where pressure drops at least 24 millibars in 24 hours. The 1991 storm plunged 50 millibars in half that time, an atmospheric freefall that churned the ocean into a maelstrom. Scientists also uncovered eerie parallels to historic shipwrecks, like the Portland disaster of 1898, another November nor'easter that sank a steamship with all hands, its wreckage undiscovered for a century. The storm's cultural footprint runs just as deep. Sebastian Junger's book The Perfect Storm immortalized the Andrea Gale's crew, blending forensic meteorology with raw human drama. Survivors of other vessels caught in the tempest described scenes straight from Melville: waves shearing off wheelhouses, life rafts vaulting into the sky like kites, and the unshakable sense that the sea itself had grown sentient. Even the rescue efforts became legend. A National Guard helicopter crew attempting to save sailors from a sinking yacht had to ditch in the ocean when their fuel ran out. All but one were rescued by a Coast Guard swimmer who leapt from a second helicopter into 30-foot swells, a feat that earned him the Gold Life-Saving Medal. What makes this storm unforgettable isn't just its violence, but the questions it left bobbing in its wake. Without the Andrea Gale's black box or survivors, we'll never know exactly how her final moments unfolded. Were the men swept overboard by a rogue wave? Did the hull crack under the weight of a plunging trough? Or did the ship, like the Pequod in Moby Dick, simply dive into the blackness of darkness? The ocean keeps its secrets, but the data, the stories, and the sheer scale of the storm's fury remind us that sometimes nature doesn't just defy prediction, it rewrites the rules of survival. And for those who work the sea, the line between bravery and recklessness is as thin as a weather map's isobar. From tsunamis that toppled empires to blizzards that crushed unbeatable armies, we've seen how weather doesn't just shape history, it hijacks it. Think about the Spanish Armada scattered like toy ships by a single storm, or Napoleon's Grand Armée reduced to frozen corpses by Russian winter. Remember the volcanic ash that painted the world blood red and birthed Frankenstein, or the hurricane that drowned 22,000 souls in one Caribbean night. These aren't just natural disasters, they're moments when the sky reached down and flipped the script on human ambition. Yet what's truly chilling isn't the past, it's the present. Climate change isn't some distant threat, it's the next chapter in this story. The heat waves that toppled governments in 2010, the floods rewriting coastlines, the wildfires erasing towns. These are today's weather interventions already reshaping politics, economies, and lives. History whispers a warning. Civilizations rise and fall not just on battlefields, but in the spaces between raindrops and gusts of wind. So tell me in the comments which of these events left you stunned. Was it the Kamikaze typhoons that saved Japan, or Washington's foggy escape that birthed a nation. Hit subscribe and join us as we keep unraveling history's greatest mysteries, where even the clouds have secrets, because one thing's certain: as long as there are skies, they'll keep rewriting our story, one storm at a time.